From a grappling legend's fall from grace to the Iceman who couldn't stay away, these are the UFC fighters who retired far too late. He may have never held UFC gold or fought for a title, but Ronaldo Jacare Sousa was undoubtedly one of the best middleweights of his era. With impressive victories over Yushin Okami, Vitor Belfort, and Chris Weidman, Jacare seemed unstoppable. However, it became clear that the Brazilian grappler was not the fighter he once was. After a win over Weidman in November 2019, his performance against Jack Hermansson 6 months later was a far cry from his previous form. And losing that fight by unanimous decision knocked him out of the title contention. An ambitious move to 205 pounds didn't revive Jacare's career either, as he was defeated by future UFC light heavyweight champ Jan Blachowicz. Perhaps this was the time to step away. Right, Jacare? Nope. The Brazilian chose to return just days after his 41st birthday for a seemingly winnable fight against Kevin Holland. Yeah, he's persistent, but shockingly, Jacare was knocked out in just 2 minutes by the Trailblazer. Despite this crushing defeat, the grappling legend continued, only to suffer another much more humiliating defeat at UFC 262, when his arm was snapped by prospect Andre Muniz. Given his stellar grappling background, this was a crushing blow to see the legend beat at his own game. Looking back, it's safe to say that Jacare held on to his UFC career a little too long, and unfortunately tarnishing his otherwise impressive legacy, while also suffering unneeded punishment, including a broken arm that can potentially cause issues later in life. Moving on to another legend who didn't know when to call it quits is the former two-division UFC champion BJ the Prodigy Penn. Known for his incredible BJJ skills and striking prowess, Penn was once and still is considered one of the greatest fighters of all time. But his career took a downward spiral after he lost his lightweight title to Frankie Edgar in 2010. BJ was never the same after that loss, with 1 win over Matt Hughes and 8 consecutive losses. Yep, you heard that right, 8. With Penn finally retiring in 2019, there was almost a collective sigh of relief from fans in the MMA world. Although at his peak, he was one of the best, it goes to show that time withers all. And we all hope the damage Penn suffered in his twilight years of fighting won't cause issues later down the road. From one legend to another, how can we forget about Anderson the Spider Silva, arguably one of the greatest middleweights in UFC history, holding the title for almost 7 years straight? But all things must come to an end, and after losing the belt to Chris Weidman in 2013, Silva's career went on a steady decline, winning only 1 of his last 8 fights against Eric Bronson, with his last fight ending with Uriah Hall knocking out the Spider in the 4th round. Silva continued fighting despite a series of unfortunate injuries and lackluster performances, and many believed his late retirement was largely due to his fierce competitive spirit and his refusal to accept defeat. Although he finally retired in 2020, it's clear that the Spider should have hung up his gloves earlier to protect his health and could have avoided a lot of injuries, including a devastating broken leg. But it's the mentality some need to have to be considered one of the greatest of all time. It's arguable to consider our next fighter as an all-time great, but depending on who you ask, he is definitely a household name in UFC history. Tito Ortiz, the former UFC light heavyweight champion, was known for his intense rivalries and aggressive fighting style. Ortiz's downfall began after his title loss to Chuck Liddell in 2006, and there was no love lost between the two, that's for sure. After the loss, Ortiz only won 1 fight of his last 8, with a submission against Ryan Bader, and finally retired in 2012 after a decision loss to Forrest Griffin. Ortiz made a series of comebacks in various promotions, only to suffer more losses and injuries. Ortiz's delayed retirement can be attributed to his desire to prove his critics wrong, and boy, did he have many. And to continue providing for his family, which is as good a motive as any. However, some might say his frequent comebacks only tarnished his reputation and put his health at risk. In retrospect, Ortiz should have stepped away from the cage earlier to preserve his legacy and his longevity. Another man who is written in UFC folklore is the godfather of ground and pound, Mark the Hammer Coleman. Making his MMA debut at UFC 10, back when everyone rode their horses to work, Coleman went on a rampage, instilling fear in his opponents and demonstrating the potential of wrestlers in the sport. But after his initial success, he struggled to maintain his momentum, losing 4 consecutive fights between 1997 and 1999. Demonstrating the heart of a champion, Coleman bounced back with 6 straight wins, including the 2000 Openweight Pride Grand Prix. Unfortunately, the end of Coleman's Pride run was inconsistent. He went 3-4 in his last 7 fights and returned to the UFC, dropping down to the light heavyweight division. But finally, his time in the sport was coming to an end. His career culminated in a knockout loss to Randy Couture at UFC 109, a battle between 2 seasoned veterans. Although Coleman managed to retire after suffering multiple knockout or submission losses, it's evident that he struggled to adapt to the rapidly evolving world of MMA. In retrospect, it was probably the smarter move for Coleman to retire earlier to preserve his legacy as a trailblazer in the sport and avoid the potential long-term consequences the brutal fight game has to offer. Up next is a man who needs no introduction to the fight scene, Rashad "Sugar" Evans. Another former UFC light heavyweight champion, was once known for his lightning-fast striking and elite wrestling skills, and his ability to match it with the best, and in many cases knock them out. But unfortunately, after losing his title to John Jones in 2012, no shame there, Evans struggled to find success in the octagon. Although he managed to beat formidable opponents in the form of Chael Sonnen and Dan Henderson, Rashad couldn't recapture his former glory, eventually losing his last 5 fights in a row. Evans' late retirement could be put down to his belief that he still had what it took to compete at the highest level. Finally, in 2019, Evans decided to retire from the sport. In hindsight, Rashad should have given both his fighting career and his body a rest. Speaking of a reputation and a body, it's a man who had excelled in both those areas. Ken Shamrock. A true pioneer of MMA, the UFC Hall of Famer was known for his submission skills and intense rivalries. Despite a successful career in the early days of the sport, Shamrock continued fighting well into his 50s, resulting in a series of losses, with only 1 win in his last 8 fights, taking a hit to his reputation. Shamrock's need to continue in the fight can be attributed to his love for the sport and his desire to remain relevant in the ever-evolving world of MMA. Although his continued participation in the sport only exposed him to further damage. Many thought Shamrock should have retired earlier to preserve his health and legacy, but sometimes ego is a hard thing to shake. And to someone who was more than likely motivated not by his ego, but for his passion and love for the sport, is Chuck the Iceman Liddell. With an impressive record of 21 wins and 8 losses, Liddell was once the most feared striker in the UFC light heavyweight division. At one point, Liddell looked almost unstoppable. But all good things do come to an end. And what spelt the beginning of the end was his knockout loss to Rampage Jackson. And after a series of brutal knockout losses, it became apparent that his fighting days were numbered. Unfortunately, this led to his late retirement in 2010 after suffering a string of devastating losses. In hindsight, Liddell should have retired much earlier and avoided so much unnecessary damage. After all he'd done in the sport, he really didn't need to prove much else. So, in the brutal world of mixed martial arts, knowing when to walk away is crucial. And these UFC fighters who retired far too late in their careers serve as cautionary tales. So, from the Iceman who couldn't stay away to a grappling legend's fall from grace, this was UFC fighters who retired far too late.